We start learning to talk when we're babies. We start learning to have conversations as toddlers, and we spend our whole lives practicing with a huge array and range of conversation partners. So by the time we get to adulthood, it feels like we should be good at this. It feels like we should be experts at conversation. And it feels like it should be easy and that we should sort of be great. But as a scientist, as I started to look at transcripts of real people talking to other real people, you realize it's almost the opposite is the reality we live in. It's actually like every conversation is more like a train wreck. We say things that don't make sense. We interrupt each other. We have half-formed thoughts. We misunderstand each other. We say things that we wish we hadn't said. We forget to say things that we meant to say or should have said. So we just it's just sort of this, what I call in the book, a tremendously complicated coordination game where we're making so many choices about who to talk to, what to talk about, how to talk about it, what we disclose while we're doing it. And so every moment of every conversation is like one of these little mini coordination games. And it's for that reason that it's so much trickier than we think it should be.
Today's episode sponsor is Aditon, creators of Aditon Operations Kit, the military's go-to software for personnel and equipment accountability. AOK goes where you do, any network, anytime, any place. I got to know Aditon's co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They are former Army NCOs who have years of experience in the tech industry. They understand that most military jobs aren't performed behind a computer desk. Personnel and operations are distributed, but accountability of property is paramount to making mission. That's where Loggy, AOK's equipment management software, comes into play. Formerly known as 92X, Loggy is a next generation of equipment management for the military. Loggy offers unrivaled features for military teams on the go. Ingest and digitize your primary and sub-hand receipts. Generate and share sub-hand receipts and DA forms with your team in just a few clicks. Capture photos, tags, and notes across your team to build context on the state of equipment. Get easy on-the-go access to critical property records. Loggy is custom built for the modern military professional. It gives you your valuable time back so you can get back to the mission at hand at home or in the field. Whether you're doing monthly inventories or preparing for deployment, Loggy is your pocket property book, giving you real-time visibility into equipment status and mission readiness. Loggy is currently in use across the U.S. Army Special Forces, and it's expanding. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Loggy for free. Visit aditonpbc.com/FTGN-Loggy to get started. That's aditonpbc.com/FTGN-LOGE. I'm excited to announce we have our own FTGN merch store where you can rep From the Green Notebook gear with high quality shirts, hoodies, hats, water bottles, and more. We are partnering with X-Ray, a veteran-owned company, to bring you From the Green Notebook elevated performance apparel and casual gear on demand that is made right here in America. Not only will you look good wearing it, but you'll also help support the podcast. And you're going to love the quality of these shirts so much that you may decide to open a unit or team level store of your own, and you can. X-Ray offers free design services and creates dedicated web stores for units so you don't have to worry about taking orders, keeping money, or keeping an inventory on hand. Click on the link in the show notes to see our store, grab yourself a shirt, and then learn how to get your own store powered by X-Ray.
How
do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Welcome to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly. And today we're diving into the fascinating world of conversations with an incredible guest, Alison Wood Brooks. She's a Harvard professor, researcher, and the author of the upcoming book, Talk. Alison has spent years studying the science of communication, uncovering what makes conversations work and why they often don't. In this episode, we unpack the art of being ourselves in conversation, the myth that some people are just natural communicators, and how we can all get better at talking at one another with a little preparation and intentionality. And what struck me most during this interview with Alison is her ability to break down complex ideas about human connection in ways that are both eye-opening and actionable. She explains why conversations feel harder than they should, how to overcome common pitfalls, and what it takes to create meaningful, engaging conversations. This is one of those episodes that'll have you rethinking every conversation you've ever had. I know that happened with me. So grab your green notebooks and please welcome to the show, Alison Wood Brooks.
Joe, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for making time for this show. As we were talking before I hit the record button, I just finished your book and now I can't unsee conversations and the science of it everywhere. So thank you for making conversations way more stressful in my life, Alison.
Oh my gosh. I talk about this effect with my students all the time as they're going through the course that I teach at Harvard called Talk. And we describe it as this sense of like hypervigilance. It's like you experience the social world in the same way that you always have, but now you are aware of like what's going on. It like turns you into Neo from the Matrix. You can see the Matrix now. And at first, I think that can be a little bit alarming and can be kind of stressful. But over time, I promise, Joe, that feeling of hypervigilance will disappear and you'll just be a better talker. I promise.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Well, the first question I have is like for a good conversation, good conversationalist, why are conversations so cognitively tasking? Because I don't think that's something that we appreciate.
Yeah.
That you talk about and really do a deep dive in the book.
Yeah, because it's so counterintuitive, right? Like we start learning to talk when we're babies. We start learning to have conversations as toddlers, and we spend our whole lives practicing with a huge array and range of conversation partners. So by the time we get to adulthood, it feels like we should be good at this. Like it feels like we should be experts at conversation. And it feels like it should be easy and that we should sort of be great. But as a scientist, as I started to look at transcripts of real people talking to other real people, you realize it's almost the opposite is the reality we live in. It's actually like every conversation is more like a train wreck. We say things that don't make sense. We interrupt each other. We have half-formed thoughts. We misunderstand each other. We say things that we wish we hadn't said. We forget to say things that we meant to say or should have said. So we just it's just sort of this, what I call in the book, a tremendously complicated coordination game. And game theorists have talked about coordination games for many, many decades. So it's famous ones would be like the game of chicken or the prisoner's dilemma. There are cooperative coordination games where people are trying to choose the same thing and coordinate their actions. So the game of chicken is a cooperative coordination game because you want both people who are hurtling towards each other to both veer right so that they don't collide. That would be successful coordination. The prisoner's dilemma is a non-cooperative coordination game. There are these two people who are sitting in jail and they are hoping that the other person doesn't snitch on them, right? There's this other person sitting in the other room. They're hoping they don't snitch on them. If both people stay quiet, they'll go to jail, but not for very long. If they both snitch, they stay in jail for much longer. And if only one person snitches, that person gets to walk free. So there's this temptation to snitch and tell on the other person. And so this coordination game is called non-cooperative because their goals are colliding. And so you sort of hope that the other person stays quiet while you snitch on them and get to walk free. So there are these old toy coordination games. But what I've realized is every conversation is like one big giant coordination game that where we're making so many choices about who to talk to, what to talk about, how to talk about it, what we disclose while we're doing it. And so every moment of every conversation is like one of these little mini coordination games. And it's for that reason that it's so much trickier than we think it should be. I mean, even think of just a conversation, ending a conversation. At the end of this, recording, we have to stop. We have to both walk away. We choose silence and we're done. But deciding when that happens is like shockingly complicated. I don't know if you want to go beyond the hour that we've allotted. I don't know if you have more questions that you're dying to ask. You don't know if I've got kids I need to go pick up or if I'm getting bored with our conversation. There's so many things that we don't know about each other and how we're feeling that make even that last coordination choice very, very difficult.
Yeah, there's something that we have in the South called the Southern goodbye. I don't know if you've ever heard of this.
Oh my God, please tell me.
It's where you think the conversation's over and then somebody asks a question that it's like, all right, Allison, thank you so much for your time today. And then I ask you so what are you doing this week? And then that starts a whole conversation about college football or your band. And then I start talking about where'd you learn to play? And then an hour and a half later, we finally say, okay, we'll see you around. So that's
I love that. Thank you so much for teaching me that. I love it so much. I've always wanted to run an experiment where you have people walking along and talking to each other and you record their conversation and it looks like they're going to part ways at a certain point in the road. And then you realize oh no, they've been instructed to go the same way. And so they have to keep talking just to see what weird things people do to make it not awkward in that moment.
I will walk the other way. Even if I don't have to go, I will walk another block or two just to avoid.
I'm picturing you sprinting away out of embarrassment, get me out of here.
Oh no, we're walking the wrong way. So as you're talking about this coordination game, so I imagine what's going on is I'm in my own head being okay, is Allison digging this conversation? Is she not digging this conversation? What's the question I'm going to ask? I'm trying to also look around. Is this okay to have this conversation in this location? And I don't think we really appreciate that when, again, because it's something we've done our entire lives. And we think that conversations should just be this natural, spontaneous thing that happens.
Yes. So much of what you just said is already a good start, an indicator that you're a good communicator. Even the way you said, I'm trying to read you. I'm trying to see if I'm digging the conversation, me, Allison. That's already better than a lot of people. Many people focus on their own perspective of, am I digging this conversation? And aren't really focused enough on the other person and whether they're digging the conversation. What you're describing is how I talk about this in the book is that we have 3 challenges. The first is self-reading. So being aware of whether you're digging the conversation and what your goals are and how it's going for you matters, but also the other person matters, right? So mind reading, figuring out how the other person is feeling, where their energy is taking them, what their goals are, what their perspective is. So hard to figure that out because you're not in their head. And then while you're self-reading and mind reading your partner, there's also this whole environment happening around you. In the example we just gave, you might be approaching a road that parts in the distance. And so being aware that there's a fork in the road is part of room reading the environment that's happening all around you. That can be changing and affecting your conversation in important ways. You also mentioned, so there's self-reading, mind reading, room reading. These are all skills that we need to work on. But you also mentioned something about feeling like we should be naturally good at it, that it's this thing that we grow up doing. And so we should be great self-readers, great mind readers, great room readers. In the book, this is what we call the myth of naturalness. When we see other people who are great at conversation, we feel like they were born that way. They are just naturally charismatic. It's part of their personality. It's who they are. And it's a little bit of a failure of mind reading, right? What you don't know is that when you see a great communicator, great chances are they thought about the conversation ahead of time. They are thinking very actively and reading their partner, reading the room, trying to figure out whether this is interesting. They're thinking about where the conversation can go next. They're relying on tons of practice of these good habits from the past that's going to guide their judgment in the moment. So there's just a lot happening in their mind that you can't see. And they probably were not born with those skills. This is something they've learned to do maybe intuitively and maybe purposefully over time in their life.
And I appreciate you saying that, because I think a lot about leadership. Leadership is one of those things where great leaders, if you really think about it, it's a set of behaviors that they adopt in order to be good leaders. And so it's something that we can also learn. And I didn't realize it till reading your book, because I also fell for the myth of naturalness. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But like, I thought that like you're either a good conversationalist or you're not. And what I realized in reading this book, and as we're about to walk through the talk maxims, that like these are all skills and behaviors that you can learn. And again, you have to have the awkwardness of reading the book or listening to this conversation and like all of a sudden becoming aware of it. Yeah. But I think like once you become aware of something and you address it, then it becomes a much more natural behavior. So I love that. So let's just go ahead and dive into it. So talk is also what we love in the military, acronyms. A great way to remember that. So could you talk about what each of the letters stand for? And then maybe we could spend a little bit of time on each one of those letters.
Well, the military is onto something, because acronyms help us remember things a lot more easily. And talk is a new acronym that I hope you will remember forever. T stands for topics, the fundamental building blocks of conversation. A is for asking, so asking more and better questions. L is for levity, and so this is humor and warmth to make sure things don't get too boring. And K is for kindness. And just like you said earlier, trying to focus as much as we can on the other person's perspective rather than our own.
Well, starting now from the top with T, and so I want to go ahead and like just tell a story, and then I'll ask questions. So with the myth of naturalness, when I started this podcast, I believed that all podcasts are just natural conversations that happen. And so when I started doing the recordings, and I was having these discussions with people, I found myself playing like popcorn, and it didn't really make sense. So like if you and I were talking, I'd ask about tea, and then maybe I would ask about your music career, and then I would like jump over to like it didn't flow naturally. And I spent so much time in my head like going, okay, like what do I need to ask Alison next? What do I need to ask? Oh my God, she's done talking. And then I would just blurt the first thing that was like at the top of my head. And then I realized that like if I were to sit down and take time before each episode and think about the themes of the episode that I want to get out of it, then the questions would follow after that. But everything got a lot easier, and I was actually able to pay attention to guests. And I'm realizing now that that's also the case with really any conversation.
Correct. I'm so glad that you came to this realization of your own volition, Joe. It's amazing. It's exactly right. And most people don't actually realize that this is something that they need to think about a little bit more care. You were nudged by your circumstances by hosting a podcast to reflect about how you can do it better. But we can all do it better. A podcast is a very specific context that requires you to think ahead and think about your goals and think about the themes and the topics ahead of time and how you might want to structure the conversation in the moment. And then when you sort of produce the episode, but that's true of almost every conversation, right? Every conversation we go into, everyone involved has their own set of goals, what they're hoping to get out of that conversation. And those goals should drive what topics you talk about. You shouldn't just popcorn around randomly to whatever's in your environment. And that's what, if left to our own devices, that's what we all do. We're sort of like, oh, well, I guess this appetizer's arriving. Let's talk about that. Or, oh, look at that weird guy over there. Like, that's strange. right? We use what's in our environment and what comes to mind to guide our conversations, when even like 30 seconds of thinking more intentionally, what is the point of this conversation and what do I hope to get out of it, will help so much in choosing what topics you talk about, right? Rather than just talking about your salty appetizer, if you're with your friend whose mother is ill, you should remember to ask about her mother, right? And you may not if you don't reflect about it a little bit.
And also with that too, like as you're describing it, like you're taking on a cognitive burden as you're like looking around the room, thinking of something to talk about. So like, what does that do cognitively when you take the 30 seconds or whatever to prepare for topics ahead of time?
Yeah, so we call this cognitive offloading. Psychologists, when you're in the middle of a conversation, there are tremendous cognitive demands on your mind. You need to be doing these little mini creativity brainstorming tasks all the time of like, what am I going to say next? What part of my brain am I going to share with this person? You're doing this curation, creative. What topic are we going to talk about next? Where are we going to go? What can I ask them? It's a tremendous burden to be doing that creativity task relentlessly as the conversation unfolds, while you're also trying to listen to the other person and not just listen to their words, but to all their body language. And, we talked about mind reading and room reading. You're doing all of that at the same time. So anything that you can do that offloads some of that cognitive effort away from the midst of the conversation is going to be tremendously helpful. And there's so much that you can do before the conversation is underway. And so topic prep is a big takeaway from this topics maxim. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time, and it's really easy. And I think many people are very averse to the idea of topic prep, especially with people we're close to. We feel like, oh, I should just like show up and I'll know what to talk about. It's going to be great. What you don't realize is even with people you love, you're going to get to these moments where you're like, oh, shoot, what should we talk about next? Or like, oh, yeah, I meant to ask them whether their kid like made the hockey team, but I forgot to ask them. So doing a little bit of topic prep before you're in that panicky moment will take away all of that disfluency and difficulty. You'll remember to ask them about their kid on the hockey team.
And again, I don't think I do that in regular conversation, but I do it in the podcast. And you're absolutely right. Like it makes the interviews way less stressful. And I feel like it gives me, like, we could sit on this topic probably for the next 45 minutes, but
totally. We got to go. We got elsewhere to go. But Joe, the same is true for your non-podcast conversations, right? Like if you were to push yourself, you don't have to read a book every time you talk to like, your sister or whatever, but 30 seconds. Hey, I'm going to see my sister later. Since the last time I talked to her, I know she's been doing X, Y, and Z. I should check in with her about those things. And I saw this funny meme that reminded me of her, so I want to show her that. And I want to ask about her presentation at work, right? Like just those three things. If you brought up any one of those things, it's almost guaranteed to be a hit. And it's going to make the whole conversation so much easier for you because you're not trying to remember those things in the moment.
And the things that you're talking about are very personalized to that particular individual. Whereas, this appetizer salty, there's a weird guy over there. The weather's weird. Oh my God, the sidewalk's about to end and we're going to have to part ways, whatever. Those are more general. And what I've realized, especially with guys, like sometimes we kind of hang out in those like general
100%. Oh my gosh. I marvel about this. I have a lot of lovely male friends and male students, and I get to observe like male friendships a lot too, my husband, and it is astounding to me how much men live in this sort of talk about whatever's in your environment kind of space. It's part of what keeps them from getting to more meaningful, deeper stuff. Actually,
yeah, and I'm glad we're talking. Like, so a lot. Like, I have a couple of really close guy friends, and a lot of my friends are women, and I feel like, and I want to talk about the topic pyramid because I think that's a really awesome thing to talk about. Because I think especially for men, this is really important too. Like, I love deeper, a lot more personalized conversations than weather, football, whatever, right? And I think that like if again taking the time ahead of time to like think through this stuff, you can kind of walk your way up this pyramid that you're about to talk about, but I keep teasing. So
Exactly. So this topic pyramid that you keep teasing is in the book. There's 3 levels of this topic pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, this is where small talk lives. These are topics that you could talk about with anybody. So it's stuff that's in your environment. It's how's the weather? How are you sleeping? How was your weekend? Stuff that we all do this. We all have small talk. The problem isn't with small talk itself. It's that we stay there for too long. In fact, it'd be weird if you didn't start a conversation at the bottom of the pyramid, right? That would be if you start and just say like, "Hey, did your mother die?" Right? Like that's also crazy. So small talk itself is important. The problem is we stay there too long. So part of our goal is to ascend the pyramid. The second tier of the pyramid is sort of medium tailored talk. So it's getting increasingly personalized. You can personalize in many different ways. You can talk about them, right? Or reveal things about your personal things about yourselves to each other. Or you can just try and find topics that they seem excited about or have expertise on. And you need to keep your eyes peeled for their energy, right? Like where can we take this where we are both feeling energized about it? That means you're getting into that medium talk zone. At the top of the pyramid, this is deep talk. This is what I think in many of your with your guy friends, you're sort of hungering for. And we're all hungering for it. I mean, like human existence is about this journey, this sort of search journey. And every once in a while, we find this mutual spark where we find ourselves at the top of the pyramid and we're like, oh my God, that feels amazing. I just learned something really important about you. I just shared something really deep about myself. I just learned something really profound I'd never thought about before. And we just did this together in this conversation. So you have these magical moments and you can feel it. Now, not every conversation needs to go there. It's okay to talk about just football sometimes, but you should be aware that we are sort of going up and down the topic pyramid all the time. And it does feel dissatisfying to a lot of people to get trapped at the base of the pyramid for too long.
Today's episode is brought to you by OneBrief, the transformative software platform redefining operational planning and military staff workflows. Imagine operations that are fast, where commanders can react to changes instantly. Small, where one person can achieve the work of hundreds. Integrated, breaking down the barriers between headquarters for seamless collaboration. Automated, freeing staffs to focus on the most critical work. Offline, continuing operations even with unreliable connectivity. And smart, making decisions no human alone could imagine. OneBrief's platform unlocks this vision and will revolutionize how tomorrow's military operates. Founded by a team of veteran planners who saw a firsthand need for smarter collaboration tools, OneBrief is built to combat real-world challenges. Now, empower your team to do more with fewer resources and make smarter real-time decisions. To learn more, visit onebrief.com. That's ONEBRIEF.com. And what's really interesting is I think, one of the things I learned is that, we think that like, well, we need to stay on this one topic, like you were talking about, like kind of like small talk or maybe just like one subject. But like actually in your research, you found that, people get the most out of conversations that have quite a bit of topics. So this idea of, thinking ahead of time, what you would like to talk about, and then kind of switching topics, multiple times throughout the conversation. I didn't even think about that before reading the book.
Oh, I'm so glad. Glad that was eye-opening for you. I find it so empowering. You can think about, you might want to think about where you start, right? Like, oh, what's my opener going to, what's my first question going to be? But you don't have to stay on it. And if you were to think like, oh, we're just going to talk about one thing, the probability that that one thing is a hit is like not that great. Like not every topic's going to go well. And you have a much better chance of finding those sort of great, deep, profound, meaningful, exciting topics if you're shifting from one to another. The secret is keeping your hand on the sort of emotional temperature of the conversation. If you feel like you and your partner have stagnated on a certain topic, it takes some confidence and assertiveness to switch to something else. And so just leaning into that a little bit more, what we found in our research makes conversations much more enjoyable, much more productive. and honestly, more fun.
Yeah. And I think a great way to do that, like, and I do it on the podcast all the time, is I'll do it through questions, which
Yep.
is a good lead in for the next one is the importance of asking questions.
Nice segue, Joe. Good. Exactly. Questions are the most common way that we switch topics.
Yeah. So what are some of the questions? I guess let me back up a little bit. Like, why are asking questions? Because that's another thing that I think a lot of people, who aren't thinking through this and thinking naturally, like I feel like our egos will naturally bring everything back to us sometimes, and we'll talk
Right.
about ourselves. Whereas like asking really opens that door to understanding of the other person. And it, like, I can't read your mind, and I'm probably, was it like 65% wrong if I was like at a, like, and that's like a high end, if
Yes.
I'm trying to read your mind. So a great way to tease out some of this stuff is through questions.
Questions are one of the most powerful tools we have in our conversational toolkit for exactly this reason. We don't know what's in someone else's mind. I have an identical twin, Joe. This might become important later. Even my identical twin, I don't always know what she's thinking, right? We had the same upbringing, we have the same DNA. We have so much about our lives is very similar, but I cannot perfectly read her mind. And so that is true for all people. We don't know what people are thinking. The only way to really understand someone's perspective is to ask them for it. Ask them questions, listen to their answers, and keep following up and learning about the contents of their mind. Psychologists know this very profoundly, that one of the greatest barriers to human connection and conflict management is our failure in perspective taking, right? It's just this incredible, we're very egocentric by nature. The human mind was built for sort of survival, so we focus on our own perspective to survive. But that egocentrism really leads us astray when we're interacting with other people. So one of the big messages in the book is just relentlessly pushing yourself to be other oriented, to try and get past your own egocentrism and really focus so much on the other person. And the easiest way to do that is by asking questions.
Are there bad questions?
Oh, that's a good one. I believe so fervently in the power of question asking that I'm tempted to say that there aren't really bad questions, but there are bad patterns of question asking that are worse than others. And I'll give you one example that we call boomer asking. Okay?
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yes.
Do you have a podcast?
I don't have a podcast. Why do you ask?
Oh, I was just wondering because I have a podcast. That was so cheesy. I'm sorry.
That was so good. It was good because I was like, oh, maybe he's really interested. Maybe he thinks that I'm ready to have my own podcast. Maybe there's a compliment coming here. And then there wasn't. It was so good, Joe. That's boomer asking. That's okay. Boomer asking. So you ask a question, do you have a podcast? And I say no, and I'm leaning in, I'm intrigued, I feel like you're interested in me, and then immediately you bring it back to yourself and you're like, let me tell you about my hit podcast. But it's funny when we do it on purpose, but what's super sad about it is like people do this constantly in their conversations. Sometimes it looks like a question and then an answer and then an immediate swing back to the question asker's perspective. Sometimes it looks like you're just raising a topic like, I watched basketball the other day, and then I let you answer, and then I'm like, but let me tell you about my coaching of my kids' basketball team, right? Like just raising a topic and then dominating the airtime on it. It just undermines all of the magic that question asking usually brings. So if I were to ask you a question, Joe, did you play basketball?
No.
You answer.
Yeah, I did when I was younger.
Yeah. What sports did you play?
I did basketball and a little bit of wrestling.
Amazing. So that time I asked a follow-up question, right? So I asked, oh, did you play basketball? Yeah, maybe. And then I ask you more like, oh, well, what did you play at? Like, I really do want to hear your perspective. Boomer asking is the opposite of that. If I say, "Did you play basketball?" You say no, and I'm like, "Well, let me tell you about my like decorated career as a basketball player in high school." It just makes you feel like I wasn't interested in you to begin with, right? It feels insincere and disinterested, and that's it's such a killer of conversation. I mean, it alienates us immediately from each other.
Yeah.
So boomer asking, don't boomer ask.
Don't boomer ask. And I think it's really important that what you said is that like we are naturally egocentric. And
Yeah.
it doesn't make us bad people. It's just
No, of course not. It's our human nature.
right. It's human nature. And so like if you're aware, like when I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, like I've done this to people. And so
You're
like
not alone, Joe. You're not alone. You're not the only one.
but it's one of those things again where it like brings it up to awareness. Like I think
Right.
like that's just one of the great things about reading a book like this is it takes things from the subconscious or
Yes,
things that we
that
weren't even.
fuzzy place in your mind where you're
Yes.
like, oh, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I do that. Oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now it's in awareness and you can actually pay attention, like, okay, like don't do this thing. And the what I really liked, what you also highlighted, and it's you talk about it quite a bit in the book too, is the art of the follow-up.
Yeah.
And I think like if you and I don't know if it was in this book or in another book. I think it was in Jeff Wetzler's Ask, which came out
Oh, yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah. I haven't read the book, but I admire the thesis of it so much. I'm dying. I need to get my hands on one and read it.
It was an awesome interview, but it's all about asking. And he like it was citing some research where I think like the more people followed up
Yeah.
after asking a question, like just really signaled to the other person that they were interested in the conversation. So again, it's just a mental note of, hey, if I'm asking Alison something, let me dive a little bit deeper on that subject instead of going back to my amazing podcast, which comes out twice.
Exactly. And I'm sure that I'm sure that Jeff in that sort of thesis is citing some research that we did at Harvard,
Oh wow!
that I did, where we studied how people ask questions on dates, men and women on heterosexual speed dates. We studied their patterns of question asking. What we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that people who ask more questions are more likely to get second dates. Um, it's true for men and women, which is important because men are much more willing to go on second dates as a main effect in general. But asking questions is equally effective and very effective for both men and women. And when we looked at these really good question askers who were getting second dates, what we found is that they naturally are asking more follow-up questions. So it's both asking more, but when you aim to ask more, you end up asking more follow-up questions, and that's where the magic lives. Exactly for the reason you're saying. It shows someone that you heard what they said, that you were listening, that you care, and that you want to know more. And all of that is magical. So it shows the other person you're interested in them. They're also going to share more information with you. So you're going to get both these informational rewards and the relational rewards. And that is why follow-up questions are a superhero.
That's cool. And something else too that I was thinking about in this conversation is like and it's the L in the book is levity. And I
Yeah.
like when I read that chapter, I immediately thought of like telling jokes and being funny, but it's just about keeping the conversation like engaged. I think you say engaged enjoyment um,
Yeah.
in the book.
Yeah, I think a lot of people when they think about like humor, they have this mindset of like trying to be funny, which is really not quite the right mindset, especially in the context of conversation. So you think of like being funny and we conjure like comedians doing stand up and a Netflix special. Those comedians have been like honing and writing those jokes for years. And then they practice 1,000 times. And then they do like, a million shows. And then they finally get to the point where they tape it or they record it for Netflix, right? That does not resemble live conversation at all. And in fact, when we think of the people who we view as funny in conversation, when you actually study them, they're not really even making that many jokes. And the jokes they make aren't that funny. It's just this, they are able to capture a spirit of play, a spirit of trust, And their mindset is not be funny, it's find the fun. Like, how do we make this fun for everybody involved? And it's not an extra sort of bonus on top of the real work that we're doing in conversation. Levity turns out to be a sort of core determinant of psychological safety and how we sort of give and perceive status in groups of people. Even making people laugh one time makes them more likely to vote for you as the leader of a group. I mean, that is, and it doesn't even have to be a funny joke, right? Like it's just the laughter itself. And you can even achieve laughter and levity without being funny at all by being very warm, giving compliments, maybe shifting topics more frequently. So levity, so important, not extra, but a core part of how to be a good conversationalist.
I was as you were talking, I was thinking about the comedian Nate Bargatze, and
Love him.
he has a joke where he's like, his wife's like, "Why are you always you're always laughing around your friends? Like, you never laugh this much around me." He's like, "My friends are professional comedians. Like, they do this for a living, and you don't." But
To be fair, if you watch comedians in live interviews, like on late shows and stuff, they're fun, but they're not that funny. I mean, they go through long pastures of talking about deep, meaningful things. They're often serious. What they are good at, and probably better than the average person, is sprinkling in fleeting moments of levity, of finding that sort of opportunity for warmth and humor so that it doesn't get too boring.
Okay, so I'm going to switch topics again.
Love it.
Kindness is the final one, and in the book, you talk about the Colbert Anderson Cooper interview, and I didn't remember it. And I looked the date; it was 2019. I was deployed, so that's why I missed it. But I watched it the other night, and man, that is such a powerful interview where, like, I found myself getting emotional watching. Yeah.
So in this conversation, Anderson Cooper has just lost his mother. She's passed away. His mother was Gloria Vanderbilt, who was very well known in her own right. So Anderson Cooper is very fresh in his grief, really, really fresh. He's invited Stephen Colbert to come and have an interview. So it's technically Anderson Cooper interviewing Stephen Colbert for his show. It's just the two of them. They're not in front of a live audience, but it's being filmed like backstage at the Tonight Show or the Late Show. But what you very quickly realize is, oh, this is not a typical interview. It's not just like Anderson Cooper interviewing Stephen Colbert. It turns out, and it starts to feel like, oh no, he's invited Stephen Colbert here so that Stephen Colbert can support Anderson Cooper in his very fresh time of grief and loss and need. And boy, does Stephen Colbert deliver. I mean, talk about goals. It's so clear that he is like intently focused on Anderson Cooper, and he is just searching for all the ways that he can be helpful to Anderson Cooper in this conversation. And he does it, and you get to watch it unfold live. And they talk lovingly about their mothers, which is a treat to see grown men talk that way about their mothers. They cover very wide-ranging topics through the whole thing. There are lots of moments of levity, but then there are also really profound moments where, especially one moment where it seems like they disagree. Anderson Cooper says, well, I wish there was a mark that you could see on my face that showed that I'm not the person I was meant to be, that I was sort of marked by this loss, and now I'm a different person entirely, sort of like Harry Potter. And Stephen Colbert at this point pushes back on Anderson Cooper, and he says, but from my perspective, like, you're entirely the person you were meant to be. You don't need a mark. Like, everything you've experienced has led you to become this highly nuanced and interesting and wonderful person that you are. There's only one you. And so technically they are disagreeing in that moment, but they do it with such kindness that it will bring tears to your eyes. And there's this clear moment. In that moment, Anderson Cooper looks down at his notes, and he said, you once said, Stephen Colbert, you have to learn to love the thing you wish hadn't happened. Do you really believe that? And Stephen Colbert pauses, and he says, yes. And so technically they're sort of disagreeing, but it's this really profound moment where they're so closely together at the same time. It's just amazing to watch. The conversation meant a lot to Anderson Cooper, so much so that it inspired him to go on and start a podcast where he goes and talks to other people about their grief and their loss. And in the introduction to his podcast, All There Is, he references back to this conversation with Stephen Colbert, saying, like, this inspired me to start this podcast. And that's the power of great conversation, right? Like, it can, one great moment, one great conversation can launch 1,000 ships.
Well, just like to kind of step back a little bit, like as Alison Wood Brooks, the Harvard professor, looks at that interview, what were some of the things that Colbert did in that interview that you saw that helps generate the kindness? Because as we're talking about behaviors that we can all do to make our conversations much better.
Yeah. He does a lot of different things. He really is living along all of the talk maxims. He's switching topics frequently. He's clearly prepared topics. Anderson Cooper's clearly prepared topics. He's got a whole stack of papers in his lap. They're asking a lot of questions, right? So especially Colbert, he's asking questions to understand how Anderson Cooper's feeling and his perspective, learn more about his mother. They're geniuses at Levity, Stephen Colbert especially. He describes his own mother as the director of a theater company because he had 11 siblings. And he's just so good at sprinkling that in there. But really what you see is a masterclass in kindness. And his kindness, from what I can tell, comes from being a superb listener. He is hanging on Anderson Cooper's every word. He's thinking about it very quickly, and he's responding to it in the direction of trying to be as supportive to Anderson as he can be. You can tell that he's a very good listener because he does several different behaviors that we can all do more of. The first is called back channeling. So back channeling is when you're listening intently to somebody and you're literally like going like, yeah, oh yeah, tell me more. It's like you're literally cheering them on as they're talking. It's so much better than just smiling and nodding because you can tell that you're sort of hanging on their every word. So Stephen Colbert does a lot of that. He takes it even one step further. He ends up sort of finishing Anderson Cooper's sentences a lot. And in those moments when he's finishing his sentences, it's almost like their minds have merged together. And it's a beautiful thing to watch unfold. And then, of course, as a good late night host, he's very good at callbacks. And so he's very good at referencing back to things that they've discussed earlier in the conversation. And these are all verbal signals that you've heard someone. So there have been decades of work on active listening, which is like smiling and nodding, leaning forward. Those are nonverbal signals you're listening. What's the masterclass in good listening is using your words to show someone that you've heard them. And so that's what Stephen Colbert is great at. He calls back to things that they've talked about before. He asks follow-up questions, and he's doing this back channeling of cheering on Anderson through the whole thing.
So I want to repeat what you just said. So like when my wife's talking and I finish her sentences.
It depends. Yeah, so this is great. So let's draw a distinction between interruptions and finishing each other's sentences. There's also a distinction between finishing someone's sentence and getting it right and finishing their sentence and getting it wrong. And so if you are someone who habitually cuts people off and guesses what they're going to say, and they often say like, no, that's not what I was going to say, you should stop and reflect and think to yourself, oh, maybe I should work on not finishing sentences quite as much as I do. If, on the other hand, you're someone who jumps in and you feel like you're getting it right and they're there with you in it and they're like grateful that you're there and it's this bubbling back and forth and you're finishing each other's sentences, that can be good, can be exciting, can be a sign that you're close and understanding each other. But also, there's also this distinction between interruptions in general. Some of them we interrupt and we stay on topic. Right? So you're so excited. You couldn't wait for them to finish talking because you're so excited about what they're saying. You're listening so intently. and you're like dying to ask a question or whatever. That's an on-topic interruption. On the other hand, there's off-topic interruptions, and these are the ones that give interruptions a bad rap. If you jump in and switch to something totally different, it's always going to feel rude. You're literally cutting someone off and saying, I'm not listening to you. I don't care what you're saying. I want to talk about this other thing. So we just have to be careful. There are good guys and bad guys in interruption land.
So just to clarify, I do on-topic interruptions, so that's a good thing. I sometimes get the fill in the blanks wrong, so I'm going to edit out that entire part of the interview where it leads to me saying,
you have to leave it in for your wife. I'm talking directly to your wife now. You have to leave it in.
Okay, so I will. And like this is like nothing to do with talking about your book, but I did this but I want to kind of go back to like the grief topic again, because when I was I read it in your book and then I watched the interview. It actually made me think. I interviewed Steve Riggio about a month ago, and he was the CEO of a Barnes and Noble as they did their large growth from single bookstore to national book chain. And him and his wife lost their daughter, who died of leukemia. And so as they're going through the grieving process, he decides that they need to do something to like come together as a couple to try to like not necessarily move past and forget, but like to move forward. And so they're both Italian heritage. So they went to a class to learn their native Italian. And they one of the assignments for the class was to translate this book that was written in Sicily. I think it was called the Biete Peali. And what was interesting is he fell in love. This became like his passion project in retirement. And so just a few months ago, this book came out, and he said kind of the same thing that Colbert said in that interview. He said, I wish this book was never written. However, it's like this book is like an expression of our love for our daughter. And so again, not really on the topic of talk, but it just made me think about that while I was reading it and while I watched the interview.
That's a great comparison. It's exactly right. I think that's true for many things, including grief and loss, but any hard thing that happens in your life, it's so easy to wish that it hadn't happened. But I think one of the greatest things we can all work towards is more acceptance. Like it did happen. And so if we were to accept that and view it as a gift, the thing that you most wish had not happened, if you view it as a gift, that makes, what can we do? What can we turn that into that would be positive? And it sounds like your guest turned it into his own book, his own project. It inspired him to take on a collaborative project with his wife that was meaningful and I'm sure at times fun and at times challenging. And they wouldn't have done that without their loss, right? So just trying to foster this sort of deep sense of acceptance is a virtuous goal for sure.
Okay, Alison. So this is where I'm going to go to you as the instructor. And because I need to switch topics again, but I felt like we just went to like a very like deep place. And I'm going to try to like
bring it back up. I'm ready for it. I'm here for it. You don't even need the preamble. I'm here for it. We can do hard and fun at the same time.
Yeah, but now it feels weird because I'm thinking about, I'm like, how do you make this transition?
Just go for it. It's always the answer. Just go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the biggest, it was towards the end of the book that I want to spend the last part of this interview talking about, because I think it's so important, especially in the military, our group discussions, because we have a hierarchy in the military, and a lot of times it's very hard to like when you're the boss, you walk into a group setting and you walk into a circle of people, and all of a sudden like everybody looks at you and you're kind of the center of attention. You're controlling the topic. But I think that's a really great place for leaders for this next part of the discussion to think about status in these groups and how you can make this group conversation a lot better by being aware of your status in that circle.
Exactly. Yes. I'm so glad that you raised this. So there's a chapter in the book about group conversation. Many of us feel like one-on-one conversation and group conversation are sort of the same task because it's the same skill. You're talking, you're listening, you're taking turns, whatever. What we've learned by studying conversation, though, is that as soon as a third person pulls up a chair, as soon as you move from one-on-one to 3 or more, up to hundreds of people, it's a categorically different task. All of a sudden, you can be part of the conversation and you don't have to talk at all. And you're still sort of considered and you're still listening and you're still learning all of that information. That is a massively different situation than one-on-one conversation. And so what we've learned about that, we have a lot left to learn about the dynamics in groups. We have much left to learn about one-on-one conversation as well, but groups in particular. But what we have learned is that it is an exponentially more challenging and complex coordination conundrum because everybody sitting around that table has a unique relationship with everyone else at the table. And just like you're saying, every group has this sort of built-in status hierarchy. In the military, there's a formal hierarchy. You're told what your rank is. But there's also aspects of informal hierarchy too. There might be someone sitting at the table who's really well respected because they're super good at a certain task, or they're really strong, or they're very kind, or they're very brave, or they've shown competence in some way. And so our status hierarchies are determined by formal things like rank in your company or rank in the military, but they're also determined by things like age, race, gender, competence, humor, all kinds of stuff. And what we've realized is we shouldn't think about status hierarchies as static. They actually shift even from one topic to the next. So even if you're the formal leader of this group and it's your job to be sort of hosting a meeting, you should be aware that if the conversation shifts to something you don't know much about, that's okay, but the status hierarchy has changed and you should be aware of that and you should respect it, right? You should be aware that someone else now in the group may be a more well-suited leader on that topic, or maybe they should be talking more on that topic, right? Just being a little bit more aware of how fluid these status dynamics can be and that they can shift from one moment to the next. In the book, we talk about the responsibility that the formal leader of a group has as the steward of a conversation. It's sort of like you're the host of a dinner party. And that's true in every group context, that somebody should step up and be the steward and take care of the sort of conversational dynamics of the group.
Well, and I think, there's some things in there too that are really important because, a lot of times a leader will walk up and, everybody will just be asking that one person questions, or naturally the attention will focus there.
Yeah.
And I think if you're not aware of that, you tend to, like, your ego is like, come on, let's eat up the airtime right now. And so I think, as you talk about like trading that off and kind of handing the airtime off to somebody else in the group, potentially like a lower status member, which I thought was really important.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? Giving space so that lower status group members can add value when they have value to add is tricky to achieve. But yeah, so status is always this sort of secret puppeteer that's driving how we naturally behave. As humans, we naturally tend to look with our eyes at the higher status members of a group. It's just what we do. Even just knowing that is like really shocking. The next time you go into a group, take a look at who everybody is looking at and who they're paying attention to. And it's always the high status members of the group. It's very revealing. So even just that, using your eye gaze alone to make sure, oh, I shouldn't just look at the high status group members. I should make sure to catch the gaze and have a moment of shared gaze with the other members of the group. So they feel like they matter, that they feel like they're welcome at this table. And maybe when the moment they have something to actually add to the conversation, they'll feel empowered to do it, because you've gone to the trouble of actually making them feel included just with your eye gaze alone. And so we found this in a research project, that leaders who go to the trouble of giving more equitable gaze to all group members, not just to other high status group members, means that those low status group members are more likely to speak and add their ideas later in the conversation.
Yeah, because it's about psychological safety. And
Yes.
that, like, as a younger ranking officer, like years ago in the military, like it used to piss me off because like a general would show up and we would have a conversation and it was like I didn't exist.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
you feel invisible.
yeah, invisible. And so like something would come up that was like I could answer the question on. And in my mind, I'm like, absolutely not. I'm gonna shut up and hold on to this information because I don't exist to this person.
Yeah, and it's a two-sided loss, right? It's their loss because you had valuable information to share and you didn't share it, and they're not learning from you. And it's your loss because you're not getting the opportunity to practice being a valued member of this group, right? And feeling proud, like, hey, I had something to add and I added it. That's where good group dynamics come from. But I think the very simplified goal of, well, we should aim for more equitable airtime is not quite right? Like the conversational dynamics are more nuanced than that. On some topics, some people have more expertise to share than others, or might have more ideas to share than others. But these subtle dynamics of like, who are we looking at? Who are we smiling at? Who are we talking to one-on-one before the meeting even starts? These are the things that can really foster psychological safety so that people feel comfortable speaking up in those moments when they actually have something to add.
And this is where too, all the things that you were talking about, like the topic switch, like topic management, topic switching, asking questions, keeping it light, keeping it kind, like you can take those with you into the group dynamics. And
Yep.
I think like, again, going back to like that word psychological safety, to where everybody that has something to contribute can participate and nobody feels like that invisible person that is standing.
Totally.
And I recognize that that's aspirational in some context, but I think it's just a way to kind of, again, help people feel more included, especially when you're talking with three or four more people.
Yes. Being in a low status position is very limiting. I mean, people are going to judge you more harshly for what you say. You have fewer options available to you about what's going to be seen as appropriate and as a value add. So it is this sort of binding, hard position to be in. Something that can be empowering to people when you're in a low status position. Question asking can be really powerful, right? Like even if you don't have any expertise on something, if you know the group's mission was to accomplish a certain set of goals, you could chime in and be like, hey, I think we may have gotten off our mission here. What if we get back to this, right? So even these tiny steering moves can be incredibly valuable, and they're available to anybody in the group.
Well, Alison, I like, this is where I'm trying to figure out how to successfully, I'm going to ask I'll do an Irish or a Southern goodbye. So when did you get into singing and songwriting? No, I'm not going to do that.
That's so amazing. I would totally love to. That's so cute. It's so funny. You have a Southern goodbye and I have an Irish goodbye. So
and the guest just got up and left. I don't even know. I didn't even say
Peace
goodbye.
Out. Yes, I play in a band and I love it so much. Talk about complicated group conversation. You try getting together with a band of 5 like smart, creative, talented musicians and trying to write music together. It's such a fabulous case study in group conversation. I feel so lucky to get to do it with 4 of my best friends.
Yeah. Do you still, I'm sorry. I'm absolutely doing what I said I wasn't going to do. Do you do live shows? I know you have music available on like Spotify and Apple Music.
Yeah. So we've been playing together for 8 or 9 years. My husband is the drummer. 2 of my colleagues from Harvard are also in the band. They're so talented. It's so much fun. We came together and we immediately, when we started playing together, we were like, oh no, we're going to have to keep doing this because they're good. Oh my gosh. And then we started for like a year or so, we just played covers in my basement. And it was so fun. But we kind of got to the end of that. And we were like, well, we've covered every song in the universe. So let's try and write our own music. And so for the last several years, we've written so much original music. We got to a point where we polished it enough that we were like, well, we should probably record it. And so we did. And we released our first small album this past summer. We play in local gigs here in Boston, and we're releasing a full-length album in the spring. And honestly, it is so fun. It's just this incredible life raft of creativity and collaboration, and there's really nothing better than making music together.
Oh, that's awesome. So in like the context of an album, like everything that we talked about, your book talk is like the singles, and this is like the deep cut, the deep track.
Exactly.
Well, Alison, thank you so much for the interview, for the opportunity to read your book before it comes out. This interview will come out, I think, about a day or two before your book comes out. So I hope people read it. I hope like hopefully by the time it comes out, I will be like Neo, and not awkwardly stumbling through the matrix. And my conversational skills will be even better because now I've actually like incorporated all this stuff into how I talk to people.
I'm confident that you will be striding through life like Neo by January, if not sooner. Joe, this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself.
I came from the mud. There's